Hello, this is the UCLA Housing Voice podcast, and I'm your host, Shane Phillips. This last episode of the year is coming out on December 25th, Christmas Day. Since many of you are spending time with family over the holidays, we figured this would be a great time to re-air our episode with Lewis Thomas on family-friendly urbanism from back in October 2021. I, of course, love all of our episodes equally, but this conversation probably did more to reorient my thinking than most. Most conversations I hear about family-friendly cities focus on family-sized housing, but Lou's research led me to the conclusion that it doesn't matter how many bedrooms you have if there are no schools or community centers in the neighborhood and no safe routes for kids to get to them. At the same time, he also introduced building-level design and organizational elements that really do seem to make a difference. I'll let him and his research speak for themselves in the rest of the episode. Enjoy, and happy holidays. The Housing Voice podcast is a production of the UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies with production support from Claudia Bustamante, Irene Marie Cruz, and Tiffany Liu. As always, you can reach me at shanephillips@ucla.edu. Now let's get to our conversation with Lewis Thomas. Joining us this week is Dr. Lewis Thomas, lecturer at Georgetown University and author of a recent article in the Journal of the American Planning Association, Committed and Won Over Parents in Vancouver's Dense Family-Oriented Urbanism. This will be our first time talking about family-friendly housing policy on the podcast, so we're really excited to talk to you, Lou. Thanks for coming on the show and welcome.
Hey, thanks so much, Shane and Mike, for having me. I'm really excited to be on this podcast and part of these larger conversations you're having about housing policy in the U.S. So thanks.
Yeah, great to have you. So the first question we always start things off with, if you were giving us a tour of your city, what would be the number one thing you'd want to show us? What are the must-see places and things? And it can be where you live now, which I know is in the DC area, or it could be Vancouver, which is what your paper is about, or anywhere else you feel you have a connection to.
Yeah. Well, I do live in DC. If we were here, I'd take you to the Drum Circle in Malcolm X Park every Sunday afternoon, which is amazing. I'm also originally from Baltimore, just up the road, which I stand by their former official city slogan as the greatest city in America. But for the point of this talk, let's talk about Vancouver, because that's where I ended up doing most of this research, though I have done preliminary research in other cities that we'll get to. But let's go to Southeast Falls Creek, which is alternately known as Athletes Village. It was built for the 2010 Olympics and then converted into a pretty successful urban neighborhood. And I would take you to the community centers that are there that really, they have a mandate to serve a broad spectrum of the population, which is different than a lot of community centers in the U.S., even though we still have them. Right. So they serve low-income residents and they serve middle-income and professional class residents in a really interesting way, preschool up through preteen and teenager programming. So that is a huge important part. Then I'd take you to some of the buildings where people live and parents live and get you to talk to those parents and see, what they like about living in these buildings and these neighborhoods. There are, like anywhere you live, there's pros and cons, but there's a lot of pros, I think, to those neighborhoods that we don't talk about a lot. And then we'd hop on a train or a car or whatever and go down to Portland, Oregon. And I'd show you how this model has been already built in a small scale in the U.S. So there's ways we can do it here. Obviously, there's adaptation, that happens with policy transfer. But I don't think it just has to be a Canadian thing. So I would emphasize that. Yeah.
I'm originally from Seattle, and okay. I would have accepted Vancouver or DC because, embarrassingly, I have not been to either. Having grew up my whole life in the Seattle area and never been to Vancouver is a great shame of mine to this day. And sometime soon I'm going to actually need to go up there and visit it.
Mike, it's great.
We haven't really given you the chance to say hi. It's been a little while. How you doing?
I'm doing well, Shane. It is great to be back on the podcast. I'm still coming to you all from London. So we've got at least 3 countries represented in this discussion in some way, shape, or form. I have been to DC, but not Vancouver.
Have you been in London long enough to give us like a brief tour of anything yet?
Oh my goodness. Not really, because I just came from the countryside. So, I've already escaped the city, and it's funny to hear people in the country like junk on London, like right now, London is the greatest place I've ever been in my life. Just as this like, weird expat having a good old time on a sabbatical. And then you go to the country and they're like, oh my God, why would you want to live there? Like, what? Okay.
Thanks for not doing the accent, by the way.
Yeah. That's been skipped for sure. Yeah.
So we can get into this. We'll try to set some context here first.
Yeah.
And one of the stats that you lead with, which makes Vancouver an interesting place to study this topic, is how the city has actually grown over the past few decades.
Yeah.
And looking specifically at the under 15-year-old population, so the kids in the city, basically, citywide, the population of these residents has been basically stagnant for a few decades. It actually went down by 1% between 1996 and 2016. But in the downtown peninsula, which is really the focus of your paper, the population almost tripled during that same time period, from about 2,200 to about 6,000, almost 6,000. So just for, some background here, why is family-friendly urbanism important? Like, what motivated you to study this? And how does this fit into, your broader research agenda of things you're working on?
Yeah. I think those stats are really important in telling. But I'll tell a personal story about how I came to this research. I was a young parent. We moved from DC to Boston so I could get my PhD when my wife was 8 months pregnant with our daughter. Wow. And our first child. And, even if we had been anywhere else, we wouldn't have had family support, and we were in a new place without family support. And, our daughter had been home from the hospital like a few weeks. And my wife was like, I can't do this alone. This is crazy. And, being a planner, I was like, well, maybe there's co-housing around or something, and there was co-housing in Jamaica Plain. And they had an open unit, which is insane and really rare. And we got in there, and co-housing it's basically a co-op with you have your own unit, but then you have, there was a kids' playroom in the building and a shared kitchen. And and this one was a really urban model. It was basically a modified courtyard building, or that was sort of open.
Okay. Yeah.
To interject though, so what your wife was saying by, I can't do this alone, she wasn't saying like, you're off working
Help me.
too much, I'm alone. Like, I need a community, right? Like, yes, I need other parents. Yeah.
It was that we can't do this alone, because I was taking advantage as much as I could of a flexible graduate schedule, which just means I was stressed out all the time and really never sleeping. But yeah, that was her concern, and we got in, we were super lucky, and it was amazing having kids there, and there were other slightly older kids at the time that, were really kind to our daughter and wanted to hang out with her. And then a lot of retired older ladies that, wanted to help us walk the kid or walk the dog. There were people we got along with better than other people, but it was this really amazing place to have a kid. And I had traveled some to Europe and to Mexico and Central America and Turkey, and had seen, and I lived in New York, really dense urban places where it wasn't weird to raise your kids there. And that just seemed like what people did, like probably like in London, that's more of a norm.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so it got me thinking, why is that not how we as planners and builders in the U.S., think about space? Like what, because at this point, the city had been gentrifying, for a decade or two. And it was mainly studios and one bedrooms, going up. And that was the marketing and the talk, around these buildings. And if I later dug into the policy documents, and that actually was, like direct strategies in DC. If we get more, there's reports from Brookings, when Anthony Williams, the former mayor of DC, said he was going to bring 100 new thousand people to the city. They actually ran models that families, even middle class and professional class families, cost the city more because of amenities. And so, if you're worried about your city, going bankrupt like DC was, having a strategy that targeted singles and empty nesters, it seemed like a better strategy. So I was curious about all that, and I started doing some research. And Vancouver had adopted these policies really in '89 is where they started applying the policies to all buildings subsidized and market rate. Mm-hmm. And then you see, in the decades following, this increase in families with children living downtown. Is that a direct correlation? Yeah, I think you can argue it is.
Were those policies unique to downtown Vancouver, or were they citywide and it was like really just a lot of families ended up there because that's where most of the housing was being built or something like that?
So we can get into this more when we get into the weeds of the policy. But you had the great episode of your podcast with Minji Kim and her research. And basically every building, Vancouver in the zones that have high density, which really is only the downtown peninsula and right across it and around False Creek, and then some transit-oriented development. But most of the city is still single-family detached housing and looks like most of Seattle, as far as like land use. Right. So those areas, pretty much every building is rezoned, and then they do a value capture. And to get your rezoning, you follow the guidelines. Mm-hmm. And so you follow the family-friendly guidelines.
Okay.
So in short, new dense buildings pretty much have to be family-friendly to get built.
Got it. Yeah. Okay. In the introduction to your paper, you reviewed some of the biases against multifamily housing, and you sort of, hinted at them just a moment ago, and especially as a place to raise children. And I think, a lot of these go back a very long time, but many persist to this day. The first thing I thought of was like back in the days when urban areas really were just desperately overcrowded, really unhealthy in terms of sanitation and the spread of disease. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on, go back as far as you like, but, up to the modern day, where do these biases against urban housing as a family-friendly housing come from?
Yeah. The best source I found on this is Robert Fishman's Bourgeois Utopias, sort of about the birth of the bourgeois suburb in early 1800s London, and then Manchester, really. That, overcrowding was an issue, but before, you even got there, you just had a new idealization and romanticization, more importantly, of nature. And this idea to, what had been weekend homes for wealthy merchants, all of a sudden you had communities being built where the men would get a carriage together, into the city, and the women and children would stay home away from the ills of the city, which had to do with overcrowding and sanitation, but also had to do with just, general ideas of social mixing and vices. And, protecting women and children from those. That sort of the dirty city was a man's place. So there's like a long gendered history of this, and that gets changed and morphs, as Olmsted with Riverside brings those kind of suburbs over to the US and they get popular here. But then you really see a lot of language in the early 20s from planners and other city professionals villainizing multifamily housing, and the National Real Estate Board working with Herbert Hoover when he was head of the Treasury, promoting single-family detached homes as sort of the moral way to raise your children, and an ethical way, the only ethical way to raise your children. Even in Euclid versus Ambler, which, is about industrial versus residential. But the justification that the Supreme Court used was to keep multifamily buildings out of single-family detached homes because they destroyed the child-bearing, like the direct quote's in my paper. I should have it here, but it's wild.
Multifamily housing is a mere parasite on the single family.
Exactly. We all know the mere parasite part. Yeah,
a mere parasite part. So it's as far as how Americans were actually using city space, there were a lot of sections of the city that were working class, that weren't horribly overcrowded. That people, kids played in the streets. It's before mass car ownership. It's before TV. It's before air conditioning. So you had a different use of public space. But then you really have the subsidies that went in to build the suburbs and to get low mortgages for returning white veterans. You have Levitt making it really affordable. You could get if you were a white returning veteran, you could get a home in Levittown with no down payment, and it was $600 a month in like today's dollars. Wow. So it was incredibly affordable for the white working class, and you have blockbusting going on. So I think, the elite class had that ideal for a long time of sort of the detached home, but as it becoming a practice and an aspiration for like working class Americans of all races now, that ideal comes a little bit later and really follows the suburbs, and like the post-war suburbs, I would think.
I feel like the fact that, this is argued to have at least partially come out of London, the UK. I feel like, isn't that where we got lawns too? Just like so many terrible ideas coming out of there, guys.
Yeah, I think the Americans have taken over the title.
We definitely supercharged it all.
Yes,
Following up on this a little bit, Vancouver is one example, but as you said, there are places all over the world where people live with kids in cities.
Yeah.
Singapore, Paris, Seoul, whatever. How do they experience child rearing in these places? Like, do these biases exist even there and people just kind of are over them? Like, what's happening in these places?
I mean, that's a great question. And I'm glad you mentioned all the cities you did. So the biases are not there like they are in the US. I think that's safe to say. I think in anywhere you go, there's going to be different preferences for, some people want to live in the city and some people want to live on the edge or outside of it. I mean, that, exists everywhere. But there's some great work by Leah Karsten, and she was interviewing families in Hong Kong. And there was some blog I read where she was talking about the research. And she talks about how it took people a while because she was asking the same questions, and families in Hong Kong, like, they didn't even understand the question, like it took them a while to get like, oh, she's asking, would we rather live in a detached home, and they sort of thought, no, I'm sure there were some that did, but in general, that's, and like that was found in Singapore too by Yen et al. And some other researchers. So I do think you can say, in other countries, it's not the same as it is here. And one other thing I want to build off of that I think is really important, just like I think you can argue, through backing mortgages and through the highways and the GI Bill, the U.S. government subsidized the building of the suburbs. Fishman in Bourgeois Utopias has this quick passage that I need to research more or write on it myself on sort of housemen in Paris subsidizing the new bourgeois apartment life as sort of, after when they built the boulevards and built all the apartments, like in one sense, that's a government subsidy, and you're creating a new lifestyle of families can live in these spacious apartments in the city. And similar things happened with Vienna and the Ringstrasse. So, I think there is a history here with, what we think of in the suburbs and in Europe with more central, apartment living of planners defined broadly, subsidizing new ideals of where families should be in the city.
Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. So moving to Vancouver specifically, Let's just start with some of the more technical aspects of what makes Vancouver relatively family friendly. And then we can kind of move on to the more informal and social elements that do seem to be really important.
Yeah.
So could you give us an overview of some of the policies that Vancouver has that are intended to make the city a more family friendly place to live? We already talked about the 2 and 3 bedroom requirements, but you can go into those a little more. I'm sure there's other things here as well.
Yeah. And I'll get into the history of these policies too, because I think that's interesting. And I have another paper on that in Planning Perspectives that we can link to. But
yeah, we will.
What's interesting about Vancouver, because we did talk about the downtown peninsula, and if you know that a lot of it is what's called the West End, which first densified in the late 50s through 70s, had this wild these sort of mini towers in the park going up. It's a different form than I've ever seen anywhere else. It's an interesting form. But those, kind of like most contemporary densification in North America, those in the 50s through late 60s were targeting the childless. And even to this day, that area is 80% studios and 1 bedrooms, which is pretty wild. So that's part of the downtown peninsula. So all that increase is on the former industrial land, that they've densified post 90s. But so there was a backlash against that. And instead of a pro-business city council that was doing that densification to raise tax money because they were scared of suburban competition, not quite flight, but like competition of suburban retail. So they, in the early 70s, TEAM comes to power, which is the Elected Actors Movement, which is this new nonpartisan centrist city government. And they're really against this density, but they're also against highways. And they cancel the highway. And then they say to themselves, okay, besides the new housing tower boom, there was the office tower boom in downtown in the 60s. So they said, how are we going to get people to work if we don't have a highway? Let's build an equitable neighborhood right next to downtown so that, from the maintenance workers to the executives, they can take the sea ferry to work. Like that was like actually their thinking, which is a really different way, than we're thinking these days.
Yeah, I was going to say that they sound like pure NIMBYs, just like don't build anything, but it actually... Apparently not, because they just had a different vision.
Well, so they downzoned the rest of the city, which is why it's so crazy. And Lay has a lot of great articles about that. But then this one former industrial land across the creek from downtown, they said, let's build a medium density, it was real missing middle, in today's terms, neighborhood. And they did, and at first people weren't moving in, and then the mayor, who was an investment banker, he moved in with his family, and then it became very popular. So it became very popular pretty fast, and was considered a success.
It's very hard to replicate that kind of policy.
It's going to be really, you can't really replicate it.
For it to work, the mayor has to move in.
Exactly.
Not a lot of cities are going to get that.
I do think though, yes, you are correct. But there were some other, I think this is the 70s when, there wasn't the push to move back to the center city like there is today. Right. So I think those forces have changed for sure. But they had this planned retail section that failed. And, and they went and did a post-occupancy report, and people were saying, all these green spaces where you thought community would form, no one's really using those. And your retail failed because there's not enough foot traffic. Maybe you should build denser. So then they do this great report. It's like 120 pages long, called Housing Families at High Densities. And it's only for subsidized housing. But it's so detailed and beautiful. It's a great, a really great document. And we can link to that online too. And so they had that for subsidized housing, and they built some really interesting products in that era. And then with False Creek North, which is when people see that picture of Vancouver and all the glass towers, that's the development called False Creek North. That was land owned by the province, not the city. And so the city knew the province was going to hire a private developer to do it. And so the city revised its guidelines from 120 pages down to 11, to like these really pithy guidelines, so that the new development going in could get the amenities they wanted and be family friendly. And so along with value capture, which is the main way they do all this. So they zone, half of what they want it to actually be and what everybody expects. And then they call it in Vancouver the land lift. So you calculate, once you get the new density, you calculate what that new value would be. And then the developer has to give the city anywhere from 20 to usually like 75% of that value, either in kind or in cash contributions. Community amenity contributions is what they call them, CACs. And to get the rezoning, you follow this 11-page document with the guidelines for family friendliness, amongst other documents, but that's one of the big ones, where you have 25% or more two-bedroom units. And now, as of 2016, you have to add 10%. They talk a lot about bicycle storage for children. They talk about sort of trying to do like a mudroom type thing when you come into your condo. There's a whole bunch of policies like that. Then they have sort of a, dedicated play space. And all of these are guidelines. So they have, numeric recommendations, but they expect each developer and each architect to do it as appropriate for the site, so it's not like a checklist, which, can take more time, but also leads sometimes to better results. So those are sort of the main things. Visual and acoustic privacy is a big one that's really important. And as an aside, another thing I found is once you get into tall concrete buildings, you actually have way better acoustics between units, less sound transfer. So that helps with family-friendly buildings versus wood frame buildings. Mm-hmm. So those are all, really big pieces. They get annually $151 million in these community amenity contributions. They also have development cost levies that go on any development anywhere in the city. And they put all that money into, a lot of it does go into affordable housing. It's still, not enough to make Vancouver affordable. And then they use that money for community centers, which are really well funded and programmed. They often have daycares. They have a daycare shortage in the city, so that's an issue. But some buildings have daycares in the building even when they get built. Childcare facilities, transportation, parks. And they do really smart things with their parks. Like you were talking about schools. The school they built in Falls Creek North, the elementary school, has a public park right next to it. And that's the school's park. So, during the day, the kids use it for soccer games and whatnot. And they have a little playground also. But then it's used by everyone in the city, in the evening and on the weekends and during the day when the kids are there too. So it is, a little bit of getting used to. It's a different model than we have, but it works there.
I did really appreciate in your paper, you included some drawings that some kids did from one of the buildings, and it was just like a compilation of them. And I learned about Dude Chilling Park in Vancouver, which was news to me. Apparently not the original name, but they officially renamed the park Dude Chilling Park.
There's a statue in it. It looks like a dude chilling. Yes. And that's...
Oh, wow.
I mean,
it's a very different
I'm surprised
vibe.
That didn't end up on your tourism list, but it's going to be on my list when I visit.
It's an okay park,
I just need to take the picture.
That drawing is the single best piece of data I ever found. On is this an ideal environment for children? This child obviously loves the building she's in, and it's a drawing of all her friends in the building. Yeah. Yeah, there's another story. It made it into the paper where a kid was out with her uncle, who's a developer or a contractor, and he's building this 3,000 square foot single family detached home, which is common in Vancouver. And the kid says, that building's so small. Right. And the guy's like, what are you talking about? It's huge. And she goes, but how many families live there? And the uncle says one, and the girl just can't believe it and said, that's crazy. So many families live in my building. Like to her, that's what you want a building to be, is tons of families. So you have lots of friends, and that's a great place to her.
And I guess, so that's an interesting thing that you should, talk a little bit about, how you designed your study and how you, kind of gathered not only this very rich history that you've shared with us, but like the specifics on the different outcomes that you found. But an interesting thing, of course, people will say, well, if you talk to the families that live there, they're less predisposed to want to live in the suburbs. They're more predisposed to want to live in the city, and they've already accepted a certain density, is desirable to them. But the kids, there's no selection bias with the kids. There might be a little bit of ingraining that goes on from one generation to the next. That like, yes, this is normal and this is good. But another really cool thing about kind of getting that that information from the kids is like, they didn't choose where to live. They like it, right? Exactly. It's normal. It's normal and good to them, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so this is a good transition, actually, because you use one of the market rate communities in the city as sort of a case study, and it's called, appropriately, The Social. And, one thing that stood out to me was how density seemed to help create this critical mass of parents who could support each other for, the little things like watching a kid while someone goes to run an errand. And one quote you have in here is from a parent is, the only thing worse than having a baby is having a baby in the suburbs. And so can you just talk about that a little bit more? I feel like dense housing, is often viewed as sort of isolating and anonymizing. And I think there's absolutely truth to that. And it can be that. But it doesn't seem to be what was happening in this building, at least.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point. And I include another quote from a dad in another building who had lived in the suburbs, and he talks about how he would just drive his car in the suburbs and not see his neighbors. And now he lives in the city in a 30-story condo in the top, and he doesn't see his neighbors. And, sort of like that neighborliness, is it can be there or it cannot be there, both in the city and in the suburbs.
Right.
But as far as the social, there are a lot of particular things about the social that do make it sort of unique, even in the Vancouver context. So what I found in talking to a lot of families that lived in market rate, basically condominium buildings, they often loved living in the city and in their building, but they didn't know a lot of their neighbors. Mm-hmm. And versus Vancouver has, compared to the U.S., it's just got slightly more social housing. It's still closer to the U.S. than, say, Europe or even England, but it does have a little bit more social housing, and they have these cooperatives, and there, it's a more intentional community. Everybody knew their neighbors. But so the social was really interesting because it had this sense of community for some of the neighbors. And I did meet some other market rate residents who talked about that in their buildings too. But, what were the particular things that allowed that to happen? That's what I was really curious about. So one of them is, in the guidelines and in a lot of the buildings that get built, they sort of, the way buildings get built is you have one sort of playground space that's often sort of tucked away, and like not very attractive and not a place you would really want to be unless you're a kid who's like at the playground. And then they have like another community space somewhere else in the building on like a roof deck or something. So they're often separated. And, when I talked to parents who lived in those, they were like, yeah, we hardly ever go to the playground because it's like dark and windy, or like, weird wind issues come up with towers, or no one's there, so they just use it a little bit. But the common space at the social, it had, what parents called the crappiest playground. And it was this one dinky little thing. And then the rest of it wasn't too fancy, which is another thing you hear complaints about, like the common space being so fancy that you don't want to take your kids there because you're scared they're going to break stuff. So I interviewed a guy in a building in DC, and, he was renting, and then they loved the building and they bought a unit there. And I was like, oh, do you use the roof deck? And he said, no, there's pebbles. So we can't take our toddler up there because he throws the pebbles off the roof deck, Exactly. These really simple designs, like no horizontal fencing, like no pebbles.
They also put the pebbles in their mouths too.
Exactly. That's bad, but not as bad as hitting someone on the sidewalk.
No.
But so the social had it was just kind of a space, and there were some nice planters, and there were some benches, and there was a barbecue, and it had a bathroom, inside off of it. So people would hang out there with their kids. And the way it got started was one mom had actually lived in a cooperative before, and had her kids at the cooperative, or her one kid. And they said they really loved it, but she said people were a little intense. That was sort of the implication I got.
A little too cooperative.
Yeah, exactly. There's all different levels. And they wanted to build equity, which is like her husband was older, and, they were worried about retirement. So they moved in there into the social. And, she said, I really missed that sense of community. So I went to the condo board and said, can I get money to have a barbecue? And they said, sure. And then she did it, and then she organized and she had some flyers up, and then she did the same thing for a Halloween event. And then after that, those two things were all she really needed to do. Mm-hmm. And then people just started saying, oh, let's go up Friday night and hang out, on this common space. And it was on the 5th floor. So it's sort of raised above traffic. If you have real little kids, you're not worried about them running out into the street. It's a nice space to be in. So it became really well used. I mean, and it's interesting, it's I think it's 100 and some units in the building. Probably there's 4 families out there, on a weekend, or something, maybe a few more. But you don't need that many people, for it to be enough. But you need that many units today to get that small amount of people to form a community. Right. If
it's only like a 20-unit building, it might just be the one.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So there really are these advantages to density. Yeah. And then the other interesting thing about the social, in Vancouver's guidelines, and if you go back and read urban design literature, there's a lot of talk around, parents should be on the first 4 floors so they can see their kids playing and be connected to the street. And you don't want parents in towers. What I found at the social is most of the floor 5 through 9 were 2-bedroom and 2-bedroom plus dens. So they were the bigger units in the building. And all the parents in the focus group that I conducted who lived there said, oh, we love living there. And, only one little wing, only 4 units could actually see into the play space or the courtyard. The rest couldn't. And it was double-loaded corridor. But when you have a double-loaded corridor, if you have all family units along it, no one's going to care if your kids are running down the hallway and you leave your stroller in the hallway. Mm-hmm. So during the focus group, there was this moment where people are like, oh, yeah, we use the hallways and we don't care, and everyone thinks it's great. And then one family was like, wait, we've gotten 3 noise complaints. Mm-hmm. That family lived on the one floor where there were just 2 bedrooms on the corners and then studios one bedrooms in between, because they didn't have a critical mass of families on their floor. And that actually comes into policy issues a lot because of the borrowed light issue in buildings. To do 2-bedroom or larger or 3-bedroom units in a double-loaded corridor plan, except for the corner units, it's hard to get those units without doing what's called borrowed light, where you have one of the bedrooms has a interior window that gets light from the exterior. Oh, okay. Which some zoning codes and guidelines, it changes city to city, don't allow that. So whereas I mean, you would have to research this more, but I don't think most kids care if their bedroom has a window or a bunch of glass bricks at the top. As long as it's fire safety and all that is accounted for, right. That doesn't seem actually like a huge issue.
Yeah. Yeah. So moving outside of these buildings, proximity to daycare and community centers, schools, libraries, parks, and other things that you describe as social infrastructure seem to also be really, really important here. So do you have a sense for the scale of these investments being made in downtown Vancouver? It does strike me that, the new buildings alone, even if there's quite a bit of development, probably can't pay for all of this stuff. And so, do you have to have a broader commitment to, that the government is going to invest in these things with its own money, not just with developer money?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think that is true. That said, with the density that Vancouver is building, they get between community amenity contributions and development cost levies, they get almost $220 million a year, out of these funds. So I do think you can do a lot, with the funds, with developer funds, more than we tend to do in the U.S. And by doing even denser buildings, you can get even more money from them. So that, that's where it gets complicated. I do think also a lot of U.S. cities have a lot of underutilized community centers and public land that they can use to build things like this. Like, right behind the social, there's one building, and this was built using developer money, but it has a library, a community center, a daycare, a coffee shop, and then 98 market rate units above it, which in Vancouver is rare to have market rate rentals. So that the city is able to own them as an equity thing, even though they're market rate, which is interesting. But, I know in DC, they can't, they've tried to build public housing on top of libraries, and they've been fought by an organization that believes libraries should be their standalone building. And you get really just if you can change the ideal to what's good urbanism to something denser and more actually more mixed. And the parents that I talked to at the social and the parents everywhere I talked to loved these community centers. And, one family who had teenagers talked about how their daughter had gone through all the programs and now was a counselor in the summer, at the community center, and had a whole cohort of friends she had been with her whole life, around the community center. He described it. He said it was like his small town in rural British Columbia, in the middle of downtown Vancouver. So, how do you get that? And I think we have a lot of resources we're not using to their fullest that would cost some money, but would maybe cost less than we would think it would. Yeah,
I know that the use of our public schools in the evenings as parks is one thing that comes up a lot here, that, traditionally they're just closed off after school's out. And it's just it's often the biggest open space in a lot of neighborhoods, especially a place like LA. And there's been a push to open those up and program them during the evenings and weekends and so forth. So that's a really good point.
That's a bizarre Los Angeles thing to me, where I grew up in St. Paul, Minnesota, it's just not like that at all. I constantly have found it bizarre that you lock, just that the fences are there in the first place. In some parts of where I've grown up, just not, it doesn't even exist.
I wonder how much of it has to do with the cars too, and keeping kids away from the streets basically. And then once the fences are up, you just use them for other stuff too.
We could have a whole other we have a whole other conversation on what makes schools so locked down.
Yes.
Yeah, there's other things going on there too, for sure.
Yeah,
but there's a whole community schools initiative, that's working in cities like Baltimore, and I just saw a talk at ACSP about it. That are trying to use schools even in other cities that have a different spatiality than LA, with that same idea, which I think is great.
Yeah. And you mentioned in the paper how even when families with children leave the downtown for more suburban neighborhoods or don't go, it's not necessarily because they want to leave or don't want to be there. You quote one parent who really did want to stay and even rented a house that was under 900 square feet in the place that they did ultimately move because they said a larger home would just feel weird to them. But they ended up leaving because the wait lists for daycares, which you mentioned, were too long in the downtown area. And I bring that up partly to just kind of opine on how big of a bummer that is. But you get a sense for that this is something Vancouver city government is trying to address, or is it just a matter of like too much change too fast, or have they really not been as responsive as they should be?
So that's really, it's a great and important question and a really complicated one. That quote is actually from an article this parent wrote. It wasn't an interview I had, but it's a really important telling, I think, story. And so Vancouver's trying to build a lot of daycares. And I mean, they're proposing really interesting things like building them on top of existing city parking garages, and I mean, they're trying to get, like, I think, really creative with it. And so a lot of the issue, you have this crazy issue with the schools downtown where the school board is controlled by the province, not the city. So, it's a separate issue. And then as we said at the beginning, the number of children in the city overall is flat, which actually means in the outer single family detached areas, because they've gotten so expensive, and they got super expensive before the condos got crazy expensive. It was always all crazy expensive, but the condos were relatively more affordable. And then around 2017 shot up to be as expensive as the detached homes. But so those school districts have lots of empty seats in the outlying parts of the city. So the city can't get money from the province to build new schools in the overcrowded downtown because the province says, well, you have all these empty seats. Right. If you send your kids really far, to empty. So that's like a huge mess in the way that the city works there. As an alternative policy, this is an anecdote I learned, or not an anecdote, a policy I learned from a colleague of mine who's a transportation planner and takes students to Amsterdam every summer and studies suburban Amsterdam. And they have a policy that the national government that if a municipality approves a new housing development, there has to be an elementary school within walking distance. So if they approve, anything sprawling, then they're on the hook to build an elementary school that kids can walk to, which I think is, another way to, like, how do we rethink neighborhoods and schools and equity and development? Whereas in Vancouver, a lot of parents complained about how far their commutes for elementary school were because there aren't enough schools downtown. And then the daycare situation it's wild. I mean, there's such a shortage of daycare facilities. I think because it got so expensive so fast, that there aren't the sort of private sector, daycares that we rely on, and they rely on in Canada too.
Yeah. And it's not like daycare shortages are unique to Vancouver or even downtown Vancouver. Yes. That's like a nationwide thing in the US. And I want to take a step back here and just like state clearly, we're talking a lot about daycares and schools, and this is a housing podcast. Maybe people are kind of wondering why that is, but I do think it's, there's a pretty clear connection. Like, we want a lot more housing in our cities. We want, for affordability reasons, for environmental reasons, for access to opportunity reasons. And if we don't have this social infrastructure to support them, it's not going to go there. There's not going to be the demand to move to those places.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, it seems like maybe a bit of a tangent, but I do think this is really central. And if we can't solve these problems, it's going to be really hard to get the housing where it needs to go.
Yeah.
So I in the title, you talk about won over and committed parents. And I found that categorization really interesting. So you have people who are sort of committed to urbanism and in living downtown, and others who were more sort of won over to that lifestyle and didn't come to it with like this strong desire. And it sort of reminds me of how we classify bicyclists. You have like the enthused and confident. You have the interested but concerned and so forth.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little more about those two categories, the committed versus won over, and sort of what we can learn from both? And I'm curious if you think there's sort of a sequence, if we should, kind of try to get the committed parents first and then move on to winning over more of them, or is it really kind of the same thing that both groups need?
Yeah, those are great questions. And I think the answer also speaks to Mike's question about the potential sample bias. Are you just hearing from the people who would be living in the city anyway, regardless of these policies? Mm-hmm. And it's true that my sample was heavily, biased towards committed urbanists. But in my interviews in Vancouver, this came up repeatedly. And I interviewed a lot of parents in Portland, Oregon, in Boston, in Washington, D.C., because originally I was going to do this big comparison case or a cross-city case. And I heard it there too, this, sometimes it's the couple just, was moving to the city in their 20s because that's what they did. And, they figured they would move to the suburbs once they had kids. So, that's a really common story, that we hear all the time. So you can think about won over urbanists of like, how do you capture that demographic and those people and keep them in the city raising their kids? And then, versus, I'm not sampling people who never moved to the city and aren't going to move to the city and, don't want to move to the city. Mm-hmm. I don't think you're going to convince them to move to the city to raise their kids. So the categories, you interview a lot of parents, or I interviewed a lot of parents who they sort of had this self-identification as not suburban, and as like an urbanite. Mm-hmm. And they talk about how they don't like the suburbs. One mother said, I asked her where she grew up and she said, suburban yuck. Oh, I hate it. That was her visceral response. And then she said, I could live in the wilderness or I could live in the city. And you sort of have that, dichotomy going on, which is interesting. But so, I met a lot of those parents for sure. But then I repeatedly kept hearing these parents say, we were going to move to the city, or I thought I wouldn't like raising my kid in the city, but I love it. And then in Vancouver, they often talked about how easy it was to have the community center. Like a great example is they have all these drop-in tot gyms where they take the basketball court and they fill it with, like a bunch of soft pads and plastic slides and big balls and little trikes. And, parents are like, these are great. We can live in a small condo and not have to have all that plastic crap in our house, in our condo. And our kid still gets it 3 or 4 days a week.
Someone else gets to clean it up too.
Exactly. Totally. The parents help put everything away. It's actually, it's a pretty nice run program, but it's free.
They're Canadians.
Yeah, they're Canadian. Exactly. They are Canadians. It's true.
They're mannerly.
Yeah. No, yes, that definitely is part of it. But you also heard, and this was something I didn't expect, but a lot of parents of teenagers talking about the bicycle network and the transit for their teenagers and how that saved them having to shuffle their kids all around. Mm-hmm. And they were really grateful for that there were these protected bikeways and that there was, good bus service and then they have a light rail. So their kids could get around and explore and see their friends on their own once they're teens. So I think the categories are really helpful because you hear a lot, a lot of this is more in popular lit than in housing research, but, preference surveys, they interview millennials or young professionals in the city and they say, oh, we're going to move to the suburbs when we have kids. And so then the city says, oh, we don't need to build housing for them because they don't want to live here. Right. Whereas I think if you build the housing and build the amenities, you're going to get the committed urbanists first to really adopt it. So your project's not going to fail, especially at first because, there's so few of these projects. But then you're going to get a lot of the won over urbanists in there. And you even get, usually or often within a couple, if it's co-parenting happening, you have one's leaning more towards moving to the suburbs, one's leaning to staying in the city. So these policies and these amenities that really cater to parents, sway those discussions, I think, a lot. When you make it easy for parents to stay,
right,
they will. And once they build social connections, then they're going to not want to lose those.
Yeah.
And they'll think about that. They'll think about, do we get the bigger yard, or do we, and have to spend 30 minutes to see our friends? Or do we just see them, a few times a week, bumping into them in the hallway or in the park?
Yeah. And I mean, you brought up kind of preference surveys, like so much of what people express as their preferences, but also so much of what people reveal as their preferences through where they choose to live and mobility is wrapped up, or, we researcher dorks say endogenous, or constrained by what's possible, right? And so, like, if really a city is generally offering you a relatively pastoral, low stress suburban environment and a highly urban environment that's not really conducive in a bunch of different ways, to raising a family, then like it's not really a choice in the way that we kind of, try to frame it or design a survey or a study on, and so this at least gets us something more on the menu to choose, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think back to Shane bringing up the story of the daycares, like the demand so easily exceeded the supply, that the city has been able to offer at this point. So I think once that change starts to happen, like it happens really fast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does seem, sort of in the same way as the individual buildings, like that critical mass is really important.
Exactly.
I want to move on here and kind of challenge some of these policies a little bit, because I think,
please,
I've always had my hesitations with these requirements that buildings have very specific, shares of 2 or 3 bedroom units, or provide, whatever facilities on site. And, you hear it's pretty common for politicians and others talking about making urban areas more family friendly to advocate for things like a minimum share of units in buildings being 2 or 3 bedrooms. And just to go through some concerns I have, one is that in many cities, the housing type we're most lacking isn't actually family-sized housing. It is the 1 and 2 bedrooms that we just didn't build a lot of in the past. Clearly not the case in downtown, but I think that's often the case. Another is I just have this sort of general ambivalence about this idea that every building needs to be like a microcosm of the entire community, as opposed to just having them specialize in different things. And, the third, and I think this is probably the most important and most concrete, is the question of whether these family units are actually going to be occupied by families. It seems like what often ends up happening, or certainly what could end up happening at least, is that the 2 and 3 bedroom units just end up being rented by 2 or 3 roommates who might actually have more income, less costs at least, and not have to worry about daycare and things like that. And so, you're getting larger units, but it's maybe not actually leading to more families. So I'm sure you've heard all these concerns before, and I'm curious, what your reaction is to them.
Yeah, no, I think those are all really valid points. What I would say is I do think, we're not lacking family-sized housing if you're talking about detached houses. Mm-hmm. But if you're talking about multifamily buildings in dense neighborhoods with lots of amenities, we really have built very little of that.
Yeah.
So right. I think that's safe to say we're really lacking those kind of neighborhoods and areas. And I agree. On one hand, I agree that, or I definitely agree that not every building should be a microcosm, of of the regional demographics or whatever. But I do think there's interesting room for mixing within buildings. Like I mentioned this in the paper, at the co-op in Athletes Village, which co-ops are different, they're more intentional. They adopted an internal policy of right of first offer to relatives of new units. So it's not a right of first refusal. There's no ability to counteroffer and take it to court. But when a unit becomes available, you're supposed to send out like an email and say, hey, does anyone have a grandparent or a parent, that wants to move into this unit? Yeah. And at that point you have, in an 84 unit building, you had three generational families. Wow. Where 3 sets of grandparents had moved in, which there's this idea of the sandwich generation, which I've personally experienced, where you're taking care of your young kids, and then you're taking care of your sick and dying parents. And it's a lot of stress and spatially. So, and also, if grandparents are healthy, they can help out with young kids.
Right.
So I think there's some kind of mixing in buildings that can be really beneficial and great. I interviewed people in DC who lived in a condo they loved, and there was an open unit, and when they had kids, their parents rented it for a year, and then moved out. I didn't get into this in this paper, but Vancouver and more Burnaby, which is a suburban municipality with Simon Fraser University, they've experimented in what they call ADUs in the sky, or granny flats in the sky, where you attach a micro unit in deed to a 1 or 2 bedroom condo that then you can expand into it and contract, as you need, and you can get a mortgage easier because you've got rental income you can factor in. So I think there's a lot of room for experimentation with form. And I do think if U.S. cities focused more on the whole package, of the neighborhood, you would get a lot of families moving into these buildings, even if they were market rate, and not having the roommate effect. Like that's what's happened. I'm in Mount Pleasant, DC, which is, a built in 1900 townhouse neighborhood. They were all cut up into multiple units during World War II. And then functioned as huge group houses in the 70s. It's a really complicated racial and class history. I don't oversimplify it. But now you've got, and this is happening in Chicago, where they're being converted back to single family homes for,
like the triple deckers that are becoming 1 unit, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think that roommate phenomenon, is the economically, viable thing for a time. But once a neighborhood becomes attractive enough, then professional class families start taking that housing back. And if you haven't got enough, public housing or mixed income housing in there, you're going to, lose the economic diversity in the neighborhood.
Okay, so I think we'll close it out with this question. And, you've mentioned this a few times. Vancouver is just a phenomenally expensive city. Yeah. And also new multifamily housing is really strongly weighted toward owner occupancy rather than rental, especially compared to U.S. cities where it's really kind of the opposite. So I'm curious how all of that factors into this, what influences both just the cost and this emphasis on owner occupancy has on the family friendliness of Vancouver and downtown in particular.
Yeah, that's another really important point. In Vancouver, all tall buildings are pre-sales, which is a really interesting, phenomenon. So you buy a building based off, looking at the architectural drawings of the building.
Like you put down hundreds of thousands or $1 million or whatever 5 years before it's ever built.
Not even that much, but you put down a down payment.
Okay.
So yeah, I don't think and when I was doing my research, units in the social were like 700,000. They've shot up. I think between a lot of people got in for like 400,000 or 500,000. Like I said, around 2017, the condo market took a huge jump, exponential jump in price. But so that, from what I've understood, talking to developers and planners in the U.S., there's nothing illegal about doing pre-sales. It's just sort of not culturally what people in the U.S. are used to doing. So I think if you could figure out a way to do that, that would be a way to get the model attractive to professional class families. I do think the reason it's been adopted so readily by professional class families is because they are condos and not rentals. I do think in the U.S., you're not going to get families that could be there's such an idea of we should be building equity in the house that we own. That's so central, like for better or for worse, and that's another discussion.
And if you're gonna spend all the money living downtown, because it is expensive,
exactly,
no matter the circumstances, rather pay a $4,500 mortgage and get a lot of equity than a $3,500 rent and get, nothing in the end.
Yeah, exactly. So, and in a lot of U.S. cities, that it's even like your monthly payment goes down once you buy. It's really crazy. So, either we could tweak policy to adjust that, or we could figure out a way to encourage pre-sales as a model. I do think, as neighborhoods really gentrify, looking into other models like co-ops and limited equity housing and mixed income housing, there's ways to make it attractive in that way, for sure, especially if you start to do that before prices get out of control. But those are sort of where, that's where like I'm going in this research agenda of sort of the all age city, trying to, how do we make affordable neighborhoods? And how do we have mixed income public schools? Just to end on schools, since we talked about schools a lot, you have a lot of like new research. It's not quite articulating this, but seems to be sort of what's happening. A neighborhood would gentrify, and then 10, 15 years later, the elementary school finally gentrifies because the demographics have already changed, and once gentrifying parents, accept the school, which is a whole complicated argument, then all of a sudden the neighborhood demographics are changed enough that it can go from 75% free and reduced lunch to 25% free and reduced lunch. And we see the opposite happening in the suburbs, where suburban schools are going from hardly any low-income students to majority low-income students. Right. So you have this, because we're not building equitable neighborhoods and we're not planning for that around schools. So that's, and how to do that is really hard, I think. But something we should be trying to figure out.
Ending on the fact that it's very hard and we don't quite know what to do, I think is a very good place to end. Very appropriate. So
it's always so hard.
Yeah. Lou Thomas, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you, Shane and Mike. I'm a big fan of both of your work, and it's such a pleasure to talk to you guys. I really appreciate it.
You can read more about Lou's work on our website, lewis.ucla.edu. Show notes and a transcript of the interview are there too. The UCLA Lewis Center is on the socials. I'm on Blue Sky at Shane D. Phillips, and Mike is on Twitter at MC_lens. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.